Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. The sun set officially at 5:11 this evening, marking the close of the yurtzeit for our beloved 11 lost. We spent the day remembering, an act which deepens our spirit and prepares us, so that when we look forward, we keep close to our hearts what matters most in our lives. Now, a mere 20 minutes later, as we slowly turn our faces to the future, we ask, where do we want to be a year from now, the next time we commemorate those lost, once again for the third time? How can we begin a conversation or several conversations that need to happen so that we can move toward a safer, a more just, and a more compassionate world? This evening's panel is the result of one community reaching out to another and another and another. Repair the World, One Hood, and the World Affairs Council approached Dor Hadash to amplify our message. They believed we had something to say and provided us with a forum, tech support, and a beautiful flyer to advertise this event. We shared our ideas of what this conversation could be. Together, we selected and invited our gracious panelists. I am so excited to work with this wonderful group of people whose communities and organizations intersect with our own. This is how communities are strengthened, how people get to know and hear one another. We work behind the scenes and in public together. We bring our voices, our skills, and our hope to one another in these most troubling times. My name is Donna Kufel, and I'm the president of Congregation Dor Hadash. Thank you to all who made this possible, and to all of you who want to learn, support our communities, and create a better world. We ask you to put your questions into the chat, and following the panel discussion, our panelists will address your questions. Each of the panelists tonight bring their unique perspective. I will briefly introduce each panelist, but they will tell you more about who they are and where their deeply felt concerns lie. First, I'd like to introduce Professor Kathy Blee. Kathy, just maybe raise your hand. Hi. A sociologist with over 30 years experience studying white supremacy and working with its victims and groups trying to stop acts of hate and violence around the country and across many parts of Europe. Professor William Chip Carter is professor of law at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. He will help us deepen our understanding through his expertise in the areas we intend to discuss this evening. Benjamin Gutschaw is a high school senior who is a student activist and community organizer for social and civic engagement at Casa San Jose. It is important in moving forward that we hear the voices of our young people. Dan Legger is a retired nurse who spent over 40 years working in pediatric neuro rehab, hospice, and palliative care. He is also the former UPMC Palliative Care Spiritual Support Coordinator. Dan is a longtime member of Congregation Dor Hadash and a survivor of the Pittsburgh Synagogue Massacre of 10/27/18. Our moderator, Symone Saul, is a member of Dor Hadash and a board member of the Thomas Merton Center. Symone is a community organizer dedicated to solving problems of violence, and she strives to help us learn to care for one another. And so with that, I will turn this over to Symone.
Thank you so much, Donna. Thank you all for being here. Welcome to everyone who is watching. We appreciate you and hope you will contribute to the conversation with your own questions for the panelists. We'll ask your questions towards the end, but do not resist the urge to add them in the Q&A box in the Zoom webinar or type them in the chat if you're on Facebook. And you can do that now and as we go along, and we'll collect them throughout the discussion. I feel so blessed to be able to spend time with and learn from these panelists who've all got really unique expertise and experience with this topic, but also a close connection to each other. So before we introduce them, I want to acknowledge that Indigenous voices are often left out of these discussions, especially here in Haudenosaunee territory, what we call Pittsburgh, where only 0.02% of the population are Native people, because most were killed or forced out at the barrel of a gun. So anytime I ask myself, where do we go from here, as we'll be asking tonight, I look to the knowledge shared with me by my Native friends to sort of see through that like decolonized anti-racist lens, and the answer becomes very clear. So I hope we can incorporate that knowledge moving forward. And before we look back at the October 27th, 2018 synagogue shooting here in Pittsburgh, I want to acknowledge that moving forward feels very ambiguous right now, as many of you are undoubtedly reeling on the heels of this election. This conversation, however, is relevant no matter what happens, because we know that white supremacy, racism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, and violence form the bloodied root of our nation and are very much alive no matter who's in office. So our work is not over after an election, but just to ground us from any anxiety we may be feeling. And in like looking towards the work ahead, I just wanted to share a song written and performed by my intensely uplifting friend, Kelsey Robinson, who will help us start on a calming and inspiring note. So we'll play a video from Kelsey Robinson.
There's a cowboy in the White House, threatening to shoot my people dead, getting high off, keeping us down, sure ain't fit for president, sure ain't fit for president. There's a pit inside my stomach from peeking at the evil weeds, choking out the flowers of liberty, making it hard as hell to breathe, making it harder to believe we can move forward. Can we move forward? There's a brother in a jail cell. He's just counting his lucky stars that he'll live to see another day's sky, even if it means between the bars, and even if there is no rifle charge. Can we move forward? Can we move forward? Can we move forward? Yeah. Can we move forward, forward?
Amazing. So thank you again to Kelsey Robinson for sharing her voice. And that's the question we are posing to you all. Can we move forward? And we'll start answering that by allowing the panelists to introduce themselves. So I'll ask you all to tell us about yourself and how you personally would define white supremacy in the context of this conversation, and how it has shown up for you in your life or work. And perhaps we can start with Professor Chip Carter.
Sure, happy to. Thanks, Simone, and thanks to everyone for having me on. So I'm Chip Carter. I'm a professor at Pitt Law School, and most of my research and teaching focus on race in the law, constitutional law, and American legal history as it relates to civil rights matters. I came by my interest in that subject prior to law school, in fact, just as a result of quite a few life experiences that led me to question some glaring inequalities, both racial and otherwise, throughout our society, and went to law school to study and work on those issues. Since becoming a faculty member, as I said, most of my writing and teaching has focused on that area, and specifically a goodly deal of my research has focused on the 13th Amendment and the legacies of slavery. A goodly part of the legacies of slavery, of course, is the use of state and private violence as a means of racialized control or control over disenfranchised and subordinated groups. And so as we get into the discussion, I may offer some specifics from my own work that may relate to the topic that we're discussing. But as a big picture matter, I would say that one thing that is critical to the maintenance of white supremacy is the ability to inflict or threaten violence with impunity. That is, to intimidate or to actually carry out violent acts, knowing that you are unlikely or less likely to be punished by the law, has been a pretty consistent theme throughout American history with regard to a variety of marginalized groups. So I look forward to the discussion on these issues.
That's an excellent point. Thank you so much for being here. And Ben Gutschow, would you like to introduce yourself a bit?
Yeah, thank you. Well, my name is Ben Gutschow. As mentioned, I'm a senior in high school and a youth activist. I work mostly on issues of immigration, environmental racism, and racial and ethnic oppression. And as said before, I'm also the community organizer for social and civic engagement at Gutschow San Jose. And for those of you who aren't familiar with our work, Gutschow San Jose is a community resource center that advocates for and empowers Latinos by promoting integration and self-sufficiency. We work to create a society where immigrants and refugees and other newcomers are treated with dignity and respect, while also celebrating and preserving their unique cultures while adapting to their new lives in America. Specifically for this conversation today, I guess how I would define white supremacy as being a belief that white people, that the white and Caucasian race constituted a superior race and should also then dominate society. And whether that's through political means or also social means, both of those together are what allows white supremacy to flourish. And it's done oftentimes through the exclusion of other racial and ethnic groups, in particular African Americans, Latinx Americans and Latinos in general, Jewish people, etc. But yeah, so I think that would go as far, at least for this conversation, as being a tool that can be used socially and politically to put white people ahead of others, especially people of color and different ethnic groups as well.
So thank you so much for your work with that. Kathy, Professor Blee, would you like to?
Yeah, so I agree completely with the definitions that Chip and Ben have brought forth about white supremacy. My area is one piece of that. I study white supremacist extremism, particularly violent white supremacism. So I've studied that in the US and Europe from the 1920s, when we had a massive Ku Klux Klan that openly ran for office and won offices across the country till today. And I'm interested in a number of things. I'm interested in how people get pulled into white supremacist extremism, how they are radicalized and moved to acts of violence. And I'm also interested in how people leave. And lately I've been studying how and why people leave, which is a very big issue because so many people, especially young people, are being reached by white supremacist content now. And it's really a social urgency that we figure out how to move them out of those kinds of ideas.
Excellent. I'm really looking forward to hearing your insight on that very specialized topic. And Dan Legger, thank you for being here. Welcome.
My pleasure. Thank you, Symone. And it really is an honor to be with you all this evening. And Donna, thank you for your lovely introduction. So I don't have the academic base for any of the wonderful knowledge that Professor Carter and Professor Kathy Blee bring to this. It's hard for me to call them professors, they're friends of mine, so Chip and Kathy. And I no longer have the youthful vigor of Ben to bring to the cause, but I do remember the 60s. I remember the year 1968 very well, which is very reminiscent of the times that we're experiencing this year and in the most recent few years. But my definition of white supremacy would be that when it's something that occurs within a hostile environment, when someone imposes their will on other people, and that person who imposes that will is white and does it because specifically other people are not white. That's something I don't presume to understand very well. My work in the past, my career in nursing, led me to, and as a chaplain, led me to understand that we cannot take any action in this world effectively and thoughtfully and justly unless we listen, unless we assess what the situation is that we want to take action about. So I hope that through my career, the greatest thing that I brought to it and the greatest thing that I can bring to my attempts to bring justice into the world as a result of having been a victim of gun violence by an anti-Semitic white supremacist is that we need to listen to one another before we act. That's very hard to do when you're looking in the barrel of a gun. Very hard to do when you're being treated physically in a dominating way by someone else. But it is something to be strived for in this life, and it's something that I hope to be able to bring to the conversation tonight.
Well, I think that's definitely a valuable skill that we can all learn from you to do better listening. So thank you all so much. I want to begin by looking at the beginning. So thinking about what ways white supremacy has been codified in the US Constitution, and whether white dominant culture is inextricably linked with racist or colonial violence. Are there laws that would extract institutionalized racism and white supremacy from our Constitution? Or is this so deeply rooted that we'd have to start from scratch? And so I welcome all of you to jump in with your thoughts, but I'd like to start with Professor Carter again for the historical context there.
Sure, happy to, and I'll address it as briefly as possible because I'm interested in hearing what other folks have to say. So I would say this in response to the first part of the question. The legal and constitutional structures that have enabled and advanced white supremacy are longstanding and entrenched. Certainly, I would say there's no longer any reasonable scholarly debate about whether slavery was a race-based institution. It was, in fact, as it evolved in the United States, one that subjected a specific race and one race only to enslavement and made persons who were deemed legally white to be non-enslavable. So the kind of race-based, if you will, caste system that was established in this country was established early on. And it is unsurprising that it filtered into the Constitution, at least in the original Constitution. There is a lot of debate about whether the original Constitution was affirmatively pro-slavery or not, but I think at a minimum, we can say that there were a variety of constitutional provisions that recognized and legitimated a system of race-based enslavement. We then saw, though, in addition to those kinds of provisions, like slave trade clause, which forbade Congress from outlawing slavery, the slave trade until 1808, things like the 3/5 clause and the fugitive slave clause. In addition to those federal constitutional legitimations of racialized slavery, there were also a series of state laws known as the slave codes that also defined slavery, that is the status of property in human beings as a recognized form of property under state law, but also established an overarching infrastructure of race-based laws that applied not only to slaves, but to anyone who was racially associated with slaves, that is free Blacks, as well as Native Americans, at least in the earlier period of the country. That sort of deeply embedded racialization of the law, both at the federal and state level, then of course permeated its way into our culture, right? So there was a self-reinforcing cycle where certain people were treated as othered by virtue of the law, which reinforced their othering by private individuals and made them be seen as less than fully human. That cyclical and embedded racialization of American society certainly has not gone away. I would say that it has ebbed and flowed over the long arc of history, but it has never completely disappeared. And we seem to be at a moment currently of a pretty high ebb. We can continue to talk about the second part of the question, whether there are ways in which the law and our understanding of the law might help to dismantle white supremacy. But I wanted to just offer that by way of background. None of our current racialized legal structures and power dynamics are new. Many of them have earlier antecedents, although they have changed in form. And so one last thing I'll mention from my research that's pertinent to this conversation in particular is that although most of my research focuses on slavery and therefore focuses upon Black Americans and their descendants, we shouldn't lose sight of the larger social construction of race more generally. And so it is only relatively recently in American history, that is probably beginning in the 1920s, that Jews were considered white legally. For most of the history of this country, Jews legally were considered a separate race. And so it is worth thinking about that as well, that the definition of race is malleable, and white supremacy seems to understand no boundaries with regard to hated groups.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to touch on that?
I will if I can. I think, especially regarding the Constitution, I'm going to take a different approach on it. And I completely agree with what Professor Carter had already said. But I think another aspect of the Constitution that has played into white supremacy being so continuous throughout the nation's history is the fact that within the Constitution, and many people are aware of this, that there's a lot of ambiguity within the language. And I think with that comes a lot of issues of trying to figure out whose narrative is being put forward. If you're looking at certain things within the Constitution, whether it's the elastic clause or different articles like the Article 3 and Section 3 and Article 3, which talks about treason, a lot of the language within the Constitution is in a way putting the power in the hands of a certain few, and kind of whether that's the Supreme Court or in certain areas of government. And I think with that comes along, you have to very much think about who is in charge, who is leading this certain branch of government, who is making the decision here. And part of white supremacy and it being so big in the United States is the fact that oftentimes in our governments, the people who are in charge have either internal biases or very much present biases that they then put forward in creating laws and different statutes. And I think that that is an aspect of the Constitution, which is really important to look at, is just how ambiguous the language is and how there's so many different interpretations of how it can be understood. And with that come a lot of problems that have allowed white supremacy to be as big as it is now.
Absolutely. Kathy or Dan, do you feel like responding to that? I think in terms of looking at the narrative, it's also important to think about this as a global issue. And I'm wondering how we can kind of step outside of our narrow American perspective and see how white supremacy may have, if you think that it's increased globally, or how you've seen this play out in other parts of the world.
I could say that white supremacist extremism has become much more globalized. So not only in the sense that it appears in many places, but in the sense that it's much more globally connected, globally directed, globally financed. And the ideas that direct, especially white supremacist violence, ideas that the white race is being replaced, are ideas that are appearing in different languages, in different texts, under different terms, but with the identical ideology all across the world. So there's a much more concerted, global white supremacist extremism that's centered in, I would say, parts of Europe, parts of India, parts of Brazil, the United States, Russia, and so forth, but it is spreading quite dramatically.
If I can also add to that, I thank you for bringing that up. That's a really good point. And just speaking also like on behalf of Casa San Jose, which works mainly with Latinx immigrants, I think white supremacy is it's a very big problem, of course, but I think also looking at it abroad, sometimes that has to be rephrased in a different way. Speaking specifically for Latin America, a lot of the times, I think it is better to kind of take it not just white supremacy, but more so light supremacy that's inspired by that. Colorism is a very big thing in many different communities. The Latinx is a big one. Latinos are not just a race, we're an ethnicity. We have many different colors and shades, people who are white Latinos and Black Latinos. I'm a mestizo, meaning indigenous and Spanish. And with that, looking in culture, looking in politics, and pretty much every sector of society, you see the lighter people often in power. And that is true in pretty much all of Latin America, whether that is Mexico or Colombia or Brazil. And I think looking globally, that's something that is seen across the world, especially India has had the caste system, which was very similar to a system that was very visible in Latin America. Brazil is where it got a lot of fame, and it was basically trying to cancel out kind of the color that you had in you, that there were certain ways that you could mate with a different person, with a white person, and at a certain time, you could no longer be considered a person of color. And that was in a way the goal of the caste system. And one of the misconceptions sometimes about Latin America too is that everybody loves each other. And yes, there is a different dynamic than in the United States regarding race and color, but at the same time, you cannot neglect these different power dynamics and structures between different colors of the community in Latin America.
Thank you for bringing that to the table. Colorism is definitely a huge example of that. You know, at the time of the October 27th attack, I was preparing to travel to Mexico to meet with asylum seekers as they neared the border. And so it's like especially poignant to me that my congregation was targeted for their work with immigrants and refugees. And that's sometimes been left out of the conversation. Do you think it's important to remember that the shooting was an outcome of anti-immigrant hate and not just anti-Semitism? And for those of you with like maybe some insight on this, like how have the congregations responded since in terms of continuing to support immigrants and refugees? I'll leave that open to anyone. Dan?
I think on a more global level, you know, what happened on October 27th, 2018 was an act of intolerance, and intolerance can be a thing that can move us forward in positive directions sometimes when that intolerance arises responsibly from something that needs to change, that has been examined and assessed well. Unfortunately, intolerance, when it is something that arises with great emotion negatively and is attached to hate and is also attached to a very small view of what the problem at hand is, it can be an outstandingly destructive force. It's so I don't know that I thank you for reminding us that the immigration issue was one that brought the shooter to the door. Congregation Dor Hadash had supported HIAS and the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, and it appears as though that was one of the significant motivators for the shooter, although we can't get inside somebody else's head very easily, can we?
Just going off of that, thank you, Dan, for just speaking and being here. But I something, you know, we can't get inside his head of the murderer, and I think something that does, I guess, point clues and makes it somewhat clear that it was also, you know, not just anti-Semitic, which of course it was, but also anti-immigrant, was the fact that he had a social media post that he put out before he murdered everyone. And that post, he essentially put forward that he believed killing Jewish people would help block non-white immigrants from entering the United States. And that was because of the support congregations who were present during the shooting supported organizations like Dan had mentioned before, like HIAS, which is the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. But thank you for bringing that up. I think it is something that is often forgotten, that it was an attack on Jewish people, but then also on the support for immigrants, in particular Latino immigrants.
Let me just say, I agree with both Dan and Ben in that kind of white supremacist extremism, the kind of virtual world that it appears that the attacker was in. Those ideas are very much tied together. You know, people aren't really directed toward anti-Semitism independently of, you know, anti-immigrant ideas, anti-Latino ideas, racist ideas. It's really an ideology, a mesh of ideas that are intertwined, and they've been intertwined the same way since the Ku Klux Klan began right after the Civil War. So it's racism, anti-Semitism, xenophobia, misogyny are very difficult to pull apart, and people in that world have those ideas tied together.
Absolutely. Well, I think that tying them together is pretty important. But I did want to ask, how does it make you feel, each of you individually, when people compare traumas and oppressions, such as the October 27th shooting and the Parkland school shooting, or ICE detention centers to Nazi concentration camps, or slavery to today's for-profit prison system? If any of you want to just talk about how you personally respond to that.
I had the good fortune of attending an event last year where about 60 people came together from all over the country, all of whom had been either survivors or victims of gun violence. And the variety of events was really extremely broad. So the notion that there's specificity about these things is something that the expertise of people like Kathy and Chip is really helpful to be able to diagnose the problem and move into areas of correction. But on an emotional level, the broadness of feelings of taking responsibility into one's own hands in violent ways, motivated by things such as being different from other people for whatever reason that is. And the injury perhaps that arose somewhere in that person's life that led them to believe that they are victims themselves, worthy of the kind of action they take, is something that puzzles me. I was so moved to sit in a room with two people in particular, one of whom was the wife of a police officer who was killed by a young person who was a drug dealer. And another person in the same room was the mother of a young man who had been killed by a police officer in an act of police gun violence that was not well thought through. The fact that these people could come together in the same atmosphere and talk to each other and see that the problems that led them there have some commonality is a starting point. And I hope that we can find more and more common starting points to be able to move the discussion, as well as the really important legal foundational points that can help move us forward as well.
I just wanted to briefly second what Dan just said. You said it better than I could have, but in response to Simone's question, I would say I take great pains to avoid comparisons of hardships and suffering. I do not think that is productive. And when people make those comparisons with regard to slavery, for example, I have a very strong reaction. When people say X is like slavery, my reaction tends to be no, slavery was slavery. However, I think Dan's point is a very powerful one, that even resisting the urge to draw comparisons doesn't mean that we can't find the points of commonality, right? It is one thing to start comparing experiences, because then you get into a game of one-upsmanship implicitly. But there are some true commonalities among the experiences that I think the more that they are discussed and exposed and excavated can have the effect of drawing people together, because they see that there is some commonality in their experiences, even if those experiences are not analogous.
just to second what both Dan and Professor Carter have already said, that I think comparing different traumas, I mean, firstly, isn't a great idea and tends not to end very well. That being said, I think that there is a great power in sharing similarities with certain traumas that you can't say that one is the same as the other, but what you can often find are these similarities between different groups, whether it's about their traumas past or present. And you see that a lot with kind of movements of today, especially if you're looking at youth movements, at the Black Lives Matter movement, that it's working a lot with other groups, and it's not saying necessarily that we experience the exact same things. It's more so saying that each of these different groups have experienced different types of trauma, often at the hands of the same person or the same government. And I think that there is something very powerful in that. Of course, I think when it gets very troublesome whenever one tries to talk about competition and making it as if one is worse than the other, or if one is more prevalent now than a different one. And that is where there's no gain for anybody really out of that, that you're really only turning two groups that in all honesty should be able to work together to fight a common enemy, and it turns one against another. And I think that's where a lot of issues come up, is when people try to make a competition out of different traumas. Comparing, however, I think there are certain benefits, but also, again, drawbacks that come to that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that we definitely need to find ways to have a conversation with those commonalities. And here in Pittsburgh, some people still find it a little difficult because we have this history of segregation here, and honestly, lack of exposure to to each other in various communities. So how can we build those relationships with other communities when the environment doesn't make those connections organically? And what are some specific opportunities that we can, show up for each other and support one another, no matter what our own, identity or experiences.
There are many ways to support each other, but one of the questions that came up in the chat just a few minutes ago is related to this, Symone. I think that someone's asking about social isolation and how this contributes to this whole issue and this problem. And I think they are related, the question that you raise and social isolation.
I was just thinking that as well.
Offering support becomes very difficult in isolation. they're mutually exclusive things, concepts. And there is, and especially now that we have a pandemic on top of everything else, the isolation is profound for some people. And in isolation, we have access to social media, which then can open up the whole world that Kathy talked about, that is so easily accessible if you've got a grape that can grow into something far beyond just a grape. And you can channel that energy into something that is so destructive and negative. So offering support is something that's difficult to do because you have to be receptive to the support. There have to be ways available to offer the support. Making phone calls to people to stay in touch is great if you know how to reach those people and have their phone numbers and keep in touch with them. But people who are closeted away and don't have any means of advertising the fact that they need some support makes for a really difficult issue. And they become very susceptible to the kinds of poisoning that's so easily available.
Yeah, I agree with what Dan's saying, and I want to build on it a little bit more. So sometimes people will talk about white supremacist extremists as becoming extremists because they were isolated persons. And that's what drew them into a life of extremism. But it's actually very often the other way around, that it's becoming involved in that kind of white supremacist extremist world, in this case, a virtual world, that makes people more and more isolated. So people can start out relatively integrated into their families or their social worlds, their friends, and the pull of that extremist world, as people become more involved in it, more believing in it, more attached to this imagined community of people on the internet, they start shedding those those connections with real people. They become much more isolated. So isolation is a little bit of cause, but also a real consequence of immersion in white supremacism. It's very dangerous. One of the things that I and other people have been doing is working with teachers, coaches, counselors, to identify when kids are becoming more isolated. So it's not identifying the isolated kid, it's identifying kids who are starting down a track of increasing isolation. And that's often or can be a tip-off to this extremist white supremacist radicalization process.
I just had two very brief thoughts, one on Simone's question and then something that Kathy just said. In terms of, how to be mutually supportive, I don't have great ideas regarding that, although I've been heartened by what I've seen, unfortunately, in the face of tragedies. But, seeing, for example, the Muslim community and the Black community responding to the shooting at Tree of Life in the way that they did, seeing the Jewish community step up toward the forefront of the Black Lives Matter protests and being supportive has been heartening. I don't have any real great specific answers to how you build and systematize those supports, but I do think it's important for the supports to be genuine and organic. So after the well-publicized spate of police shootings of African Americans this summer, my colleague and dear friend David Harris just called me up and said, "Hey, how you doing, man?" Right? And we had a good long conversation that I would not, to be candid, at that moment have had with many other non-Black people at all. There was a foundation of trust in a relationship there that actually made that a very helpful conversation. And conversely, in the wake of the shootings, David and I had a similar conversation in the other direction. And so I think kind of having organic points of connection perhaps makes it more meaningful and more obvious where you can find mutual supports when larger moments dictate them. The other point, and maybe Kathy, if you wouldn't mind elaborating on what you just said, because you and I have talked about this in other settings, but I think it would be helpful for the group to hear. Talking about the line where a person moves from what I'll inartfully call a more passive white supremacist stance into an active and extremist stance. It is not, as I've learned from you and others, as simple as it seems. So would you mind elaborating on that a little bit?
Sure. And actually, this goes back to maybe our earlier conversation about comparing tragedies. So I agree with what people were saying about the problems of comparing tragedies. Although it is helpful, I think, to compare different episodes of white supremacist violence, because we've learned a lot. And one of the things we've learned by looking at these in the United States and around the world is that they very much follow a pattern. And how people move from, as Professor Carter was saying, being passively involved to taking steps, toward horrific violence is pretty well known. And it's mirrored in what happened in Pittsburgh. The first step is they become convinced that there's a very serious threat, a huge threat to something, to the, it could be to the environment, to the planet, to the economy, whatever. The second step is they become convinced that there's a particular group that's causing that threat. And that group we know is in white supremacy is, typically all the enemies of white supremacy, Jews, people, descendants from Africa and Asia and, so forth. Third, and this is a really critical part, they become convinced, or let me say it another way, they become taught, because this is deliberately messaged out in white supremacy, that the threat is absolutely urgent. It's not a matter of time, it's a matter of days. Something terrible is going to happen to your world, their world, in a very short period of time. And fourth, the issue that we haven't raised, they have an opportunity, they have some opportunity to act. And the opportunity, in many cases, certainly in the United States, is access to gun, and not just guns, but, assault rifles and high level weaponry. So that pattern, threat, enemy, urgency, and opportunity is a very well established pattern. So we actually know a lot about how these, terrible tragedies get started, how somebody can start out, as Professor Carter was saying, kind of passively involved and end up, a perpetrator of, mass casualty violence.
Yeah, that I do want to definitely address further with the next. I'm going to ask sort of a series of questions to lump together like some final thoughts. But before we move to questions from our viewers, so I just want to say real quick, please put in the chat or in the Q&A section, if you're in the webinar, any questions that you have for the panelists. And my final question will be sort of what, how can we like find these sort of like, if how can we identify this in a way that creates a culture that we can intervene before violence occurs? What are specific policies that we either need to protect and support or dismantle in the immediate term? Like, what can we, look to keep each other safe? And also, what examples can we look to globally or historically that have succeeded in repairing societal wounds caused by dominant imperialist or colonial groups? So basically, what works in creating unity?
So I'll jump in here briefly. There's a well-known African-American law professor named Derek Bell, a native son of Pittsburgh, a graduate of the University of Pittsburgh School of Law, and the founder of the field of critical race theory. And so he takes a view that some consider very pessimistic, others consider realistic, called interest convergence. And to paraphrase a famous article he wrote on this subject, we seldom see advances in the rights and status of subordinated groups occur simply out of the altruism of the dominant class. Rather, we tend to see those advances occur and only occur where they also advance the interest of the dominant elite, whether it's a racial elite or an economic elite or otherwise. I say that many people view that as a rather pessimistic assessment, and many people disagree with it, so I don't mean to suggest that it is gospel. But one tool, of course, in thinking about how to move forward is to identify strategies and opportunities that are seen as redounding to the benefit of those who have whatever form of power is leading to the subordinating relationship. So we saw, I think I'm using the past tense now, we saw some momentum building toward criminal justice reform matters when it became very obvious that the cost of incarcerating people for long terms who did not need to be incarcerated was drawing money away from other priorities that people who were among the elites would rather pursue. And so I don't know what all of those interest convergence moments are, but I just wanted to point out from the perspective of critical race theorists, again, subject to criticism and disagreement for sure, they would suggest that we cease relying upon goodwill and altruism to make advances in this area, and that we engage in a very deliberate form of realpolitik. Moral shaming and moral suasion, this school of thought would suggest, will not alone change much of anything.
If I may, I think working to bring people together and to unify these voices and stories, speaking, I guess, from a youth perspective, and some may disagree on this, but I think something that has been incredibly powerful and is very useful for anybody going into the future is just using social media and the internet as a tool and as a way to make yourself more informed. I think in the world we live in, being ignorant is somewhat of a choice, in the sense that it's very easy to figure out what's happening in many different places of the United States and the world for that matter. And I think with that is a type of energy and a feeling that is in my generation that I think is very special and unique to us, that we in Gen Z, you could say, grew up with technology, with social media, with all of these things in our life for pretty much all of our conscious memory. And with that, for me at least, there's a lot more of a deep connection to people who I don't even know, that many people in my generation, whether it's on TikTok or on Snapchat, we can see in a minute and less than a minute in a second what's happening in a different part of the country. We can see injustice that is happening in a different location that, it's not the same as what's happening in my city, but it could be similar. And we have very similar situations, whether it's experiences with learning how to defend yourself if somebody comes to shoot up the school, because there are trainings that for my age group, we have to be aware and how to protect ourselves. With different police brutality, you have these experiences that are not just in Pittsburgh, but nationwide, and being able to see these connections all over the country and even beyond that, all over the globe, gives a feeling of unity. Seeing Black Lives Matter protests happening not just in Pittsburgh, but in California, and happening in Scotland, all of these places around the world, and you have such easy access to it with technology. And I think that's one of the things that I would, I guess, push for, is just being able to stay, for one, educated and up to date on what's going on in the world, and trying to connect with others who might be similar to you and also who might not be, to hear different stories and understand that the world is very big, but at the same time, we're all people.
That's really lovely, Ben. Thank you for that. The difficulty, the blessing and the curse that we have in this world is that we have such availability to be able to, as you just said, Ben, hear what somebody else has to say within a second and identify with it or react to it in some way. The difficulty that presents is knowing sometimes how truthful and accurate it is. Because it is so available, and we tend to trust people who we may trust for not the most clear reasons. It's easy to be moved in certain directions that can not always be healthy directions. But I don't know that I consider myself as much an optimist as a hopeful person. I think that the world really is a better place than it was 200 years ago. Certainly better than it was 1,000 years ago. And I think we've come a long way. The dangers that we face are so real because the tipping points in all of the areas of danger have such greater consequences. We have potential to cause harm so easily and quickly and accessibly in ways that were harder to pull off, but in past times. But the idea and Chip, you brought up this idea about one expression that you used, moral shame, I think it was, moral shaming. Shaming seldom gets us very far. Pointing out somebody's reasoning is really difficult when emotions are attached to it. And if you attempt to sway someone by shaming them, that indicates to me that you're frustrated and trying to get to the point more quickly. But we live in such an era where the idea of I'm right and you're wrong, and let's find a reason to blame the other for the problem is so prevalent that it's refreshing when we have conversations like the one we're having tonight. And I just pray that they'll all continue in a positive direction.
Super quickly, thank you, Dan, for saying all that. And I completely agree that something that I've learned, and I actually considered writing a college essay on this just because I thought it was really cool. Like growing up for one in a swing state and seeing all of these different political opinions since I was pretty much little. Granted, in my own mind, it's gotten to a scale that's too out of scale, but at the same time, I'm grateful for hearing all these different I guess, perceptions of the world and how it is that whenever I was younger, I was very much competitive in soccer, and I played on a team where it was mostly all suburban kids who, at the time, it was during the Trump election, the first one, and I was the only kid of color, the only kid from the city, and that proved to be difficult in some instances, but at the same time, I knew that kind of all of the people on the team, that they were at the same time my family, you know, that they cared about me. And if somebody would be mean to me on the field, if somebody said something racist towards me, they would be the first ones to stand up, even though they might not agree with some things that I do politically. They were the ones to stand up for me because they knew me as a person, knew me beyond my skin color. And I think being able to have those conversations and really getting to know people personally is something that, for me at least, has shown to be one of the best ways to unite and work with each other, because in the larger picture and from my own experience, I've seen, of course, bad things and people do certain actions that I would not do myself and that I don't agree with nor condemn. But at the same time, I feel like a lot of people don't do stuff out of hate, that they're not oftentimes driven to, in a way, specifically hurt another. Of course, there are instances when that does happen, but for the most part, I believe that people don't go out of their way to hurt others, that oftentimes they believe what they are doing is what is right, that they fully 100% believe that the path they're going down and the work they're doing is helping others, helping themselves, helping the world. And that a lot of the times it is just different perceptions, different ways of thinking about the world. And being able to actively listen is something that I think is one of the most influential and impactful things, because oftentimes in conversations we're thinking about the next thing to say, the what we can do to follow up, how we can argue, how we can come up with a good way to make our argument heard so that we are the victor. But instead, what I've learned is that it's really important to listen. Having silence after somebody talk isn't a bad thing. Being able to really understand and try and think about where they're coming from, that I might not believe the way that you do, I might not think how you do, but I at least need to know where you're coming from so that I can have a conversation to discuss what is going on.
Yes, I feel that so deeply. Thank you. Like, listening, definitely a huge takeaway. I do want to take the opportunity to do a couple of questions from the chat. And we, I guess, would be remiss to totally ignore the current state of our country. And so Richard asked regarding Kathy's previous explanation of how someone moves from a passive to an actively violent situation. Richard asks, you know, the approach our president has taken to the election threat of a fraudulent vote, and how might people be responding to that in a way that like creates that sense of urgency that you were talking about? How, you know, what should we expect? Is there, you know, are there things that we can do to counter that?
So I would say people who are studying the white supremacist, extremist, and related threats around in the current situation are concerned greatly about the shift of white supremacist extremism into new spaces. So the ideas aren't new. They're the same ideas really since the beginning of the Klan, and even a lot of the form isn't new. White supremacism has always been very conspiratorial and so forth. So there's a lot of people talk about things now as if they're new, but they're pretty much the same over time. But what's new and very disturbing is the penetration of those ideas into two directions. One is into the mainstream political rhetoric. I mean, what you were just talking about at the election, and more broadly into the mainstream political rhetoric. And the second is the penetration of those ideas into non-political mass culture. So, for example, things like mixed martial arts, it's very heavily penetrated by white supremacism. Online gaming, the Anti-Defamation League did a chilling study and found out that kids who play online games, just innocent, just, you know, kid games, not with no political content, over the course of a year, 21% of those kids were approached by white supremacist content through these little cartoon kid games. So there's a, you know, a move of those ideas into both culture and politics that is extremely alarming to me and to other people who are following this.
I'll just add one brief thought. I don't have any insights into how this relates to the election specifically, but one thing spinning off of what Dean Blee just said is this. One of the hallmarks that has been striking to me that has moved from the margins into the mainstream over the last few years has been the acceptance and exaltation, if you will, of extra legal solutions to social problems. So until relatively recently, until you know, even when people were sharply divided on an issue, it was generally agreed that the resolution laid within the boundaries of some formalized process. I have seen an increased penetrance of extra legal, non-legal, whether it's individual or mob-based solutions to social problems that is strikingly different, to me at least, than just you know, a decade ago, but is also strikingly similar to something that was a hallmark of Jacksonian society prior to the Civil War. So in the 1820s, the kind of Jacksonian element of our society, which was largely amplified by President Jackson, exalted the person, the man, standing athwart society and refusing to follow the rules and achieving his or her goals through whatever measures were necessary. And that there's some eerie parallels there, because that then became a hallmark of the early pro-slavery, anti-abolition, white supremacist organizations then. And so that's how you give rise to something like the early Klan, right? The idea that you're standing athwart society and you have an obligation to disregard the rules and the rule of law, because that's for suckers, right? Whereas real strong people do the job themselves. And there are a variety of ways in which I've seen that play out in our political discourse across the spectrum in ways that concern me deeply.
Yeah, wow. Thank you. I couldn't afford law school, so this is deeply enlightening to me. I appreciate it. I'll ask one more question from the audience, which Ben already sort of eloquently touched on, but Alan asked, we respond to other people's suffering differently depending on whether we know or identify with the victims. This bothers me deeply, as I realized acutely on 27th October 2018, but I presume that there are reasons why we respond this way. Should we be working to learn to feel more empathy when bad things happen to people we don't know, or would that render us completely helpless? Do we just need to overcome our unfortunate feelings of identity and difference?
Thank you for that question. It's really an important one. And, you know, undoubtedly, we tend to respond to people who we see as similar to ourselves in ways that are more empathetically generous than those to whom we feel a difference of identity. This is something that our shrinking world has, I think, helped us to do better at. We still have a long way to go, for sure. But there's no question that this is something that is a problem and that we need to really work at. I was speaking with my friend, Reverend Tim Smith in Hazelwood recently about this, the idea that the support that was given to the Jewish community, not just to the victims and the synagogues involved, but to the entire Jewish community when the events of 1027 happened, compared to what happens in neighborhoods of color and in incidents where there's not a cohesive identity even of people, but where awful things happen, behooves us to really make sure that the support that we give is there. And if I could just address, this is sort of related in a way to the previous question too, but you know, we have to be careful to whom we give power. There are offices and positions in our country that have authority associated with them, but we are the ones who ascribe and give power to those offices. And you know, if you look at the degree of power that was given to the 44th president as opposed to that given to the 45th president, we all should have share a level of shame about that, because the world has given power to someone in a position of authority that just by virtue of paying attention. One of the wonderful things about being a parent is that you learn when someone's having a temper tantrum how to deal with it. And we have a very difficult time in our culture of television personalities as opposed to real people who know real information and ways of solving problems. That there's a difference between those two things. That's as political as I'll get tonight.
Thank you so much. So I just want to allow all of the panelists to just take a couple minutes to say any closing remarks with a couple of questions in mind. One is what message you want our friends watching to leave with as they learn, cope, and strategize in the coming months. And then, you know, what are our goals for the next year in keeping each other safe? Like where do we go from here? So whoever would like to start.
Well, I'll just sort of finish where I left off. And I guess if I have any parting messages, you know, one of the great, the creed, if you will, of the Jewish people comes from the Shema, which means to listen. And we truly have a responsibility to find ways to listen to each other. And I think that it's a really hard thing to do. It sounds like an easy thing to do, but it's really difficult, because if we are truly listening to each other, we have to do, as Ben said, not think about what the next sentence that comes out of our mouth is, but what is going on in the heart and soul of the person who is addressing us. We have to do this in a way also that doesn't put us in a position of being taken advantage of. And so that balance of knowing how to protect each other and ourselves, and knowing when to stand up and say, this is intolerable, is one of the great challenges of life. And patience and listening go hand in hand, and balancing that with times of knowing when to act is really a hard thing to come by. And that's what we're trying to do by talking as we are this evening. So thanks very much for the opportunity.
I guess I'll just follow Dan. I agree completely with what he's saying about how we need to approach other people and listen to other people. And at the same time, I just want to amplify his point about the ideas. We're at a point where we really need to be pushing back very clearly against ideas that have come into the mainstream that are dehumanizing and dangerous and promoting violence. And we just can't have those as part of our cultural and political fabric, as if those are normal, acceptable ways of being and ways of thinking about other people. So I think, working with people, but also being willing to really name the ideas that are absolutely out of line in any kind of society is important and hard to do.
So I'm also pulling a page from both Dan and Kathy by saying this. I think a quote I learned at the funeral service for Pittsburgh attorney Roz Littman, who was a pioneering women's rights and senior woman attorney, was justice, justice you shall pursue. It is one of the commands that can be hard to keep, right? You're tired, you're scared, you're exhausted. And I think kind of keeping the shoulder to the grindstone in the ways that Dan and Kathy say is challenging but important. The other thing I would say is that being fearless in calling out injustice, but being empathetic in how you deal with people, I think is important. I think there is a very important difference between condemning an idea and condemning a human being. And one of the most alarming statistics I've seen recently, and I think I'll get this right, was something close to 15% of survey respondents on both the left and right believe that the world would be better if their opponents simply did not exist. And that line between condemning ideas and condemning the people who hold them is A, dangerous, and B, when it comes to white supremacists, if I'm understanding the implications of the research of people like Kathy, is counterproductive. It simply will not work in any meaningful way. And so I just want to say, as we continue to pursue justice and rightly call out injustices, we should be careful of how easy it is to cross the line between condemning an idea and condemning a person.
Thank you, Professor Carter. That's really it's inspiring. Yeah. I guess what I'll leave people with are just, I guess, reiterating a few things that I said before, and then something new. But firstly, to actively listen and actively learn, as mentioned before, really do listen to others and what they're saying and try and understand where they're coming from. Active learning, for me, and what I mean by that is kind of going out of your way even sometimes to learn and stay educated on certain issues, even if they don't directly involve you and per se people who look like you or identify like you do, but really trying to understand other perspectives that are present in the United States, even if you don't agree with them. Lastly, to stand together with others, whether that's in protest, whether that's in solidarity, whether that's in many different forms, but to stand for those who may have helped you or who you can identify with or just sympathize with even as well. And lastly, really to, if you have the ability to try and volunteer at certain organizations. There's many organizations in Pittsburgh and in the country as a whole, depending on where you are. And I think a lot of the times the work that we do can seem impersonal if you're not kind of seeing it day to day or seeing the true impact. And volunteering can be very, very life-changing for a lot of people, really seeing the issues up close, whether that's with unlawful deportations or police brutality or gentrification. Working in different nonprofits that focus on these areas, you get much more of a firsthand kind of experience that you can see. And in doing so, you start to sympathize and really see where they're coming from, see why these issues are more than just a policy, that they're about human life, about a human right. And really going out of your way to actively learn, not just on the internet, but in person.
Awesome. I know that I said that was the last question, but I just wanted to say that earlier this year, Ben, you spoke at a press conference, the Drop Kokum press conference, which is a local, Kokum is a local foundation that funds anti-immigrant hate groups. And during that, you said, I am afraid to speak for my own safety. I am afraid that after today, I will be a target. And if we look at the current trajectory towards fascism and the way it's played out in other nations, the risks and sacrifices only increase the longer we refuse to take those risks, and more people become targeted as time goes on. So sort of to all of you, like, how do you overcome that fear by, you've all spoken up, you've all faced various risks. And how do you find the courage and strength to speak up? And how would you encourage others to do so?
I guess just going off of where I was and about that press conference as well, what was scary, I know for me, was the fact that kind of that organization, the Kokum Foundation, in a way hates kind of everything about who I am. Being that, one, I am an immigrant. I wasn't born in the United States. I was born in Guatemala. I am Latino and I'm much looking like it too. I don't have the privilege to be kind of a white passing Latino like some people are. And then additionally, I'm also gay, and that itself also has its own issues and kind of attacks. And the Kokum Foundation is an organization that really kind of goes and targets immigrants through greenwashing, saying that essentially the environmental crisis of climate change, and I work a lot with climate change and racial injustice within that it is a fault of overpopulation and the fault of specifically immigrants from Latin America is what kind of they push forward. And they support many different groups that are known hate groups that are funding many different bad things in the country. Yet this foundation, the Kokum Foundation, also funds half of Pittsburgh. If you look at pretty much any environmental place within the city, you will tend to find one of their donors being Kokum. And what makes me feel a little better and what has helped me a lot is, for one, having a good support system. So having people to be there for you and to make sure that you don't feel alone. And secondly, to find a limit and a balance. I think that specific press conference was probably one of the farthest that I will go because I did feel endangered. And I think for people who do public speaking and even for talking in smaller groups and just to one-on-one as well, that there's a difference between kind of standing up for what you believe in, but at the same time, you have to be very conscious of what is safe and what isn't. Because if you're at a point and if you're speaking in a place where your life is at risk and very much so in a place that you genuinely don't feel like you could make it out, that is a point when in my own mind, it's not worth speaking up in that instance, that there are different ways to go about it. And it's really a trade-off of trying to figure out what is safe enough for you and what isn't. That you can take some risks, but other ones are very not the best idea, to say the least. So just being conscious of your own safety, but then also standing up for what you believe in and having people by your side when you do so.
I could just add real briefly, I think your risk calculus is a very important one for the reasons that Ben noted. And your risk calculus is different on different issues at different times, at different stages in your career, right? And so I think, it's up to each individual to decide how much risk they can responsibly absorb at a given time on a given issue. That said, I would say, one risk minimization tactic until one has built up sufficient social capital that you have some insulation, is to draw on the social capital of others, right? So you all have people in your networks who can provide cover and vouching and inroads and other things that can minimize some risks and perhaps make you comfortable taking them. That's kind of like professional and career risks. And I will say, I'm a tenured law professor, so if somebody doesn't like what I say, what are they going to do? I'm taking almost no risk in that regard. On the other hand, I have unsurprisingly become increasingly mindful, both in light of the synagogue shootings and in terms of police encounters, of issues of physical safety that don't influence what I say, but they very much influence where I go. And that, again, is kind of part of my risk calculus that may be different from others. And so for certain things, maybe I'm not the right person to physically go in certain places, and someone has to go in my stead. So that's a long-winded way of just kind of doubling down on what Ben said. You should not feel ever that you are not doing enough if your own risk calculus leads you to pass on some opportunities. That's completely fine.
Thank you both for speaking to that, and thank you so much, all of you, for sharing and teaching us today, and inspiring us to move forward together. I hope everyone here takes it to heart, and I encourage viewers to put in the chat how you're going to carry this knowledge, what you'll do in your own life to prevent white supremacist violence and show up for each other. If you want to add anything to the chat while we're wrapping up. I just want to say thank you so much to One Hood Media, World Affairs Council of Pittsburgh, Repair the World, Congregation Dor Hadash for bringing us together today. If you're looking for more perspectives on this topic, I definitely encourage you to check out One Hood does virtual broadcasts called This Week in White Supremacy, which incorporates humor and a lot of realness in their education. So someone had asked previously that I repeat the name of the indigenous land that Pittsburgh is on, and that is Haudenosaunee territory. It has also been home of the Wasahe people, and you can find your native land, I think it's native-land.ca. You can look up a map for that, and just leaving with some wisdom and gratitude from the Haudenosaunee people. They would have a daily Thanksgiving address because gratitude for our world and each other helps remind us of our own humanity. So I will just read a couple brief excerpts from them. And so they say, today we have gathered and we see that the cycles of life continue. We have been given the duty to live in balance and harmony with each other and all living things. So now we bring our minds together as one, as we give greetings and thanks to each other as people. Now our minds are one. We now turn our thoughts to the trees. The earth has many families of trees who have their own instructions and uses. Many people of the world use a tree as a symbol of peace and strength. With one mind, we greet and thank the tree life. Now our minds are one. We gather our minds to greet and thank the enlightened teachers who have come to help throughout the ages. When we forget how to live in harmony, they remind us of the way we were instructed to live as people. With one mind, we send greetings and thanks to these caring teachers. Now our minds are one. We have now arrived at the place where we end our words. Of all the things we have named, it was not our intention to leave anything out. If something was forgotten, we leave it to each individual to send such greetings and thanks in their own way. Now our minds are one. So thank you to Kathy, Dan, Chip, and Ben, and everyone else, Donna, Joe, for your tech moderation. I hope everyone watching has a lovely evening and stays safe.